My daughter Jessica stood outside my bedroom door with a key in her hand, looking me straight in the eye as she said the words that would change everything between us forever. "Mom, we're doing this for your own protection. You can't be trusted to make good decisions anymore." What she didn't know was that by the time that lock clicked shut, I had already decided she would never see a penny of the $7 million hidden in accounts she didn't even know existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The whole nightmare started 3 months earlier on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October, when I made the mistake of mentioning to my children that I'd been feeling a bit forgetful lately. I was 68 years old, living alone in the house where I'd raised them, and yes, I'd been having some senior moments. Nothing dramatic, just the usual things that come with age. Walking into a room and forgetting why I'd gone there, misplacing my reading glasses when they were on top of my head, occasionally calling Jessica by her sister Amanda's name. Normal stuff that happens to everyone as they get older. But my children heard forgetful and immediately jumped to dementia. They heard senior moments and decided I was mentally incompetent. Most importantly, they heard living alone and saw dollar signs dancing in their heads, though they disguised their greed as concern for my well-being. I should have seen the signs earlier. The way Jessica started showing up unannounced to check on me, the way my son Timothy began asking pointed questions about my finances and whether I'd updated my will recently, the way Amanda started suggesting that maybe I should consider moving to a nice community where there are people around to help if you need anything. They were circling like vultures, and I was too trusting to realize what was happening until it was almost too late. The first real warning came when Jessica arrived at my house one Tuesday morning with a stack of legal papers and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, Timothy and I have been talking, and we think it would be a good idea for you to sign a power of attorney document. Just as a precaution, you understand. That way if something happens to you, we can take care of your affairs without having to go through all the legal hassle." I looked at the papers she'd spread across my kitchen table, noting the official letterhead and the dense legal language that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. "What kind of power of attorney are we talking about, Jessica?" "Oh, just a general one. Nothing too complicated. It would give us the authority to handle your banking, pay your bills, make medical decisions if you're unable to. Standard stuff that every responsible adult should have in place." Something about the way she said responsible adult made my skin crawl. There was an implication there. A suggestion that I was no longer capable of being responsible for myself. I'd raised 3 children as a single mother after their father died when they were young, worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat, put all of them through college, and somehow managed to accumulate significant wealth along the way. But now, because I'd admitted to being occasionally forgetful, they thought I needed their protection. "I appreciate the concern," I said carefully, "but I'm not ready to sign anything like this. If I ever need help managing my affairs, I'll let you know." Jessica's smile tightened. "Mom, you're not getting any younger. These things are easier to arrange when you're still mentally competent. If you wait too long, it becomes much more complicated." There was that word again, competent. As if my mental state was already in question, as if signing over my legal rights was inevitable, just a matter of timing. I gathered up the papers and handed them back to her. I said, "I'm not interested. Jessica, please respect that." She took the papers, but her expression had shifted from concerned daughter to frustrated adult dealing with a stubborn child. "Fine, but don't say we didn't try to help when things get complicated later." After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the coffee mug she'd used and trying to understand how my relationship with my children had reached this point. When had they stopped seeing me as their mother and started seeing me as a problem to be managed? When had their love become conditional on my compliance with their plans for my life? I called my longtime friend Helen Patterson that evening, needing to talk to someone who knew me well enough to give me an honest perspective on what was happening. Helen and I had been friends for over 30 years, ever since our children were in elementary school together. She'd watched me navigate single motherhood, build a successful career in real estate, and make smart financial decisions that had paid off handsomely over the years. If anyone could tell me whether I was overreacting to my children's behavior, it would be Helen. "They want you to sign a power of attorney." Helen's voice was sharp with concern. "Margaret, You need to be very careful about this. I've seen this happen to other people our age. Adult children get impatient waiting for their inheritance and start looking for ways to gain control over their parents' assets. But they're genuinely worried about me, Helen. I have been forgetful lately. Honey, we're all forgetful at our age. That doesn't make us incompetent. Have you had any medical evaluation of your cognitive abilities? I hadn't, because I knew there was nothing wrong with my mind beyond the normal effects of aging. I was still sharp enough to manage my investment portfolio, still capable of handling my own affairs, still mentally competent by any reasonable standard. My children had simply decided that any sign of aging was evidence of decline, severe enough to warrant their intervention. You know what you need to do, Helen said. You need to get a formal cognitive assessment from a neurologist, get it in writing that you're mentally competent. That way, if your children try to challenge your decision-making ability, you'll have medical documentation to back you up. It was good advice, and I followed it the next week. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, a geriatric neurologist recommended by my primary care physician, put me through a comprehensive battery of tests designed to evaluate memory, reasoning, and cognitive function. The results were exactly what I'd expected: normal cognitive function consistent with my age, no signs of dementia or serious cognitive decline, completely capable of managing my own affairs. Your children are probably just worried about you, Hawkins said as she reviewed the test results with me. It's natural for adult children to become concerned when they notice their parents aging, but based on these tests, you're mentally sharp and fully capable of making your own decisions. I left her office with a written report documenting my cognitive competence and a renewed sense of confidence in my own judgment. My children's concerns were not based on any real evidence of decline. They were based on their own anxieties about aging, and I was beginning to suspect their eagerness to gain control over my assets. The situation escalated the following week when Amanda called to invite herself over for dinner. Amanda had always been the most manipulative of my children, skilled at using emotional appeals to get what she wanted. She'd learned early in life that tears and dramatic declarations of love could often accomplish what direct requests could not, and she'd never outgrown the tact. She arrived at my house carrying a casserole dish and wearing the kind of expression that suggested she had something important to discuss. We ate dinner and made small talk about her job as a marketing coordinator and her husband Paul's latest business ventures, but I could tell she was working up to something. The real conversation didn't begin until we were cleaning up the dish. Mom, I've been thinking a lot about our conversation last week, about Jessica's suggestion that you consider signing a power of attorney. I thought I made it clear that I'm not interested in doing that. I know, but hear me out. The thing is, we're all worried about you living alone in this big house. What if you fell and couldn't get to the phone? What if you forgot to turn off the stove and started a fire? What if someone took advantage of you financially because you're not as sharp as you used to be? Each hypothetical scenario was designed to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to live independently, to make me question my own competence and safety. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of emotional manipulation disguised as loving concern. Amanda, I appreciate your worry, but I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. I have a medical alert system, I'm careful about kitchen safety, and I'm not gullible enough to fall for financial scams. But Mom, you have to admit you've been more forgetful lately. Last month you called me 3 times in one day asking about the same thing. The week before that you couldn't remember whether you'd already paid your electric bill. She was right about the forgetfulness, but she was exaggerating its significance and ignoring the fact that I'd handled both situations appropriately. I'd called her multiple times because I'd genuinely forgotten our earlier conversations, but the subject I'd been asking about was important, and my repeated calls ensured I got the information I needed. I'd questioned whether I'd paid my electric bill because I'd misplaced the receipt, but I'd resolved the issue by calling the utility company and confirming that the payment had been processed. Being occasionally forgetful doesn't make me incompetent, Amanda, it makes me human. I'm not saying you're incompetent, Mom. I'm saying you might benefit from having some help managing things. That's what families are for. There was that word again, help, but the kind of help my children were offering wasn't assistance, it was control. They didn't want to help me manage my affairs, they wanted to manage my affairs for me, with or without my consent. If I ever need help, I'll ask for it. Until then, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I'd appreciate it if you'd trust me to know my own limitations. Amanda's expression shifted from concern to frustrated, the same look Jessica had worn when I'd refused to sign the power of attorney papers. Fine, but don't come crying to us when you get yourself into trouble because you're too stubborn to accept help when it's offered. The conversation left me feeling unsettled and slightly paranoid. My children were clearly coordinating their efforts to convince me that I needed their intervention, but their arguments were based on hypothetical dangers rather than actual evidence of incompetence. They were treating my natural aging process as if it were a medical emergency requiring immediate action. I decided to do some research on elder abuse and financial exploitation, wondering if what my children were doing had a name and whether other people had experienced similar situations. What I found was both enlightening and disturbing. There were entire websites dedicated to helping older adults recognize the signs of financial abuse by family members, and many of the warning signs matched exactly what I was experiencing. The pattern was always the same: adult children who became overly concerned about a parent's mental state, often in response to normal signs of age. They would begin with suggestions about power of attorney documents or changes to living arrangements, always framed as being for the parent's own good. When the parent resisted, the children would escalate their tactics, sometimes enlisting other family members or even professionals to support their position that the parent was no longer capable of independent decision-making. The goal was always the same: gaining control over the parent's assets while the parent was still alive, rather than waiting for inheritance after death. It was a form of premature inheritance, justified by claims of protection and concern but motivated by greed and impatience. Reading about other families who had gone through similar situations made me realize that my children's behavior was not unique or spontaneous. They were following a playbook, probably without even realizing it, that had been used by countless other adult children who decided their parents were no longer capable of managing their own lives. The knowledge was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant I wasn't imagining things or overreacting to normal family concern. Terrifying because it meant my children were actively working to gain control over my life and my assets, regardless of whether I needed or wanted their help. Timothy's visit the following week confirmed my worst suspicions. My son had always been the most direct of my children, less inclined toward emotional manipulation than his sisters, but more willing to make blunt statements about what he thought needed to happen. He arrived at my house on a Saturday morning, with a manila folder full of documents and the kind of determined expression that suggested he'd come prepared for a confrontation. "Mom, we need to talk seriously about your situation. Jessica and Amanda have told me about their conversations with you, and I have to say I'm concerned about your attitude toward getting the help you need." "What help is that, Timothy?" "The help of your children who love you and want to make sure you're safe and secure in your old age. The help of people who have your best interests at heart and want to protect you from making mistakes that could jeopardize your future." He opened the manila folder and pulled out several documents: power of attorney forms, information about assisted living facilities, and what appeared to be financial statements from my bank accounts. That last item made my blood run cold. How had he gotten access to my banking information? "Timothy, where did you get those financial statements?" "I had a friend who works at the bank run a credit check on you. I wanted to understand your financial situation so we could make informed decisions about your care." "You had no right to access my financial information without my permission." "Mom, I'm trying to help you. These statements show that you have significant assets that need to be protected. If something happens to you, if you develop dementia or become incapacitated, you need to have systems in place to ensure your money is handled responsibly." There it was, the real motivation behind all their concern. My children had discovered that I had more money than they'd realized, and they wanted to make sure they could control it if anything happened to me. They weren't worried about my safety or my well-being. They were worried about their inheritance. "My financial affairs are none of your business, Timothy. I'm perfectly capable of managing my own money. Are you? Because according to these statements, you've been making some unusual transactions lately, large withdrawals, transfers between accounts, changes to your investment portfolio. That doesn't sound like the behavior of someone who's thinking clearly. The transactions he was referring to were legitimate financial moves I'd made based on market conditions and investment opportunity. I'd moved money from low-yield savings accounts into higher-performing mutual funds, consolidated some smaller accounts for easier management, and made strategic withdrawals to take advantage of favorable tax situations. They were exactly the kind of smart financial decisions I'd been making for decades, but Timothy was presenting them as evidence of mental incompetence. Those transactions were all legitimate financial decisions, made in consultation with my investment advisor. Just because you don't understand them, doesn't mean they were inappropriate. Mom, you're 70 years old and managing a portfolio worth millions of dollars. Don't you think it might be wise to have some oversight, some safeguards in place to prevent mistakes that could cost you everything? The only mistake I'm in danger of making is trusting my children to respect my autonomy and judgment. Timothy's expression hardened. Fine, if you won't listen to reason, if you won't accept help voluntarily, then we'll have to explore other options. What other options? Legal options, medical evaluations, competency hearings. There are ways to protect elderly people from themselves when their families have legitimate concerns about their decision-making ability. The threat was clear: sign over control of my life and my assets, voluntarily, or they would try to force me to do it through legal means. They were prepared to have me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't comply with their demands for power of attorney authorization. After Timothy left, I sat in my living room feeling sick to my stomach. My own children were threatening to have me declared incompetent because I wouldn't give them control over my money. They were willing to destroy my reputation, my independence, and my dignity to gain access to assets they felt entitled to inherit. I called Helen again that evening, needing someone to confirm that what was happening to me was as outrageous as it seemed. They threatened to have you declared incompetent. Helen's voice was sharp with anger. Margaret, you need to protect yourself immediately. You need to see a lawyer, get your affairs in order, and make sure they can't challenge your mental competence. But Helen, what if they're right? What if I am starting to decline, and I just can't see it? You just had a cognitive evaluation that confirmed you're mentally sharp. You're managing a complex investment portfolio successfully. You're living independently without any problem. The only thing that's declined is your children's patience with waiting for their inheritance. She was right, of course. My children's sudden concern about my mental state had coincided exactly with their discovery that I had significant assets to protect. If I'd been poor, they would never have questioned my ability to live independently or make my own decisions. The next morning, I called Catherine Morrison, an estate planning attorney who had been recommended by several friends who dealt with similar family situations. Catherine specialized in helping older adults protect their assets from financial exploitation, including exploitation by family members. What you're describing is unfortunately very common, Catherine told me during our initial consultation. Adult children often become impatient with waiting for inheritance and look for ways to gain control over their parents' assets while the parents are still alive. The key is documenting your mental competence and setting up legal structures that protect your right to control your own affairs. Catherine recommended several immediate steps: updating my will to ensure it reflected my current wishes, establishing a revocable trust that would protect my assets while allowing me to maintain complete control during my lifetime, and creating advance directives that would prevent my children from making medical decisions on my behalf without my consent. Most importantly, she recommended that I consider changing my estate plan entirely if my children continued to pressure me for control over my affairs. Many of my clients find that once their children show they're more interested in inheritance than in the parents' well-being, it becomes necessary to redirect assets to people or organizations that will actually honor the parents' wishes and values. The suggestion was shocking but also liberating. I'd always assumed that my children would inherit my assets simply because they were my children, but Catherine was pointing out that inheritance was a privilege to be earned through love and respect, not a right to be claimed through birth and manipulation. Over the next few weeks, I worked with Catherine to restructure my estate plan in ways that would protect me from my children's attempts to control my life while I was alive. We set up a revocable trust that gave me complete control over my assets during my lifetime but would prevent my children from challenging my competence or trying to gain premature access to my money. We also drafted new advance directives that specifically named Helen as my healthcare proxy instead of my children, ensuring that any medical decisions would be made by someone who actually respected my autonomy, rather than people who saw me as a problem to be managed. Most importantly, we created a new will that reflected my growing understanding of my children's true priority. Instead of leaving everything to people who had threatened to have me declared incompetent, I designated the bulk of my estate to go to charitable organizations that actually helped people rather than exploiting them. The process of restructuring my estate plan was both empowering and heartbreaking. Empowering because it gave me back control over my own life and assets. Heartbreaking because it forced me to acknowledge that my children were not the people I'd raised them to be, or at least not the people I'd hoped they would become. But I felt a sense of relief when the legal documents were finalized and safely stored in Catherine's office. Whatever my children tried to do to me, they would not be able to gain control over my assets or my medical care without my explicit consent. I had protected myself from their attempts to manage my life for their own benefit. The protection proved necessary sooner than I'd expected. 2 weeks after my final meeting with Catherine, Jessica arrived at my house with her husband David, and a man I didn't recognize, introducing him as Dr. Kenneth Marsh, a geriatric psychiatrist who specialized in evaluating elderly patients for cognitive decline. "Mom, we've been talking, and we think it would be a good idea for you to have a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, just to establish a baseline, you understand, so we can monitor any changes in your mental state over time." The presence of the psychiatrist made it clear that this wasn't a request, it was an intervention. They had brought a medical professional to my home to evaluate my mental competence, probably hoping to get evidence that would support a legal challenge to my decision-making ability. "I appreciate your concern," I said carefully, "but I recently had a cognitive evaluation with Dr. Patricia Hawkins, and the results showed that I'm mentally competent and fully capable of managing my own affairs." Marsh stepped forward with the kind of professional smile that was supposed to be reassuring but felt condescending. "Mrs. Patterson, I understand you may be resistant to another evaluation, but your family has some legitimate concerns about recent changes in your behavior. A second opinion never hurts, and it might provide reassurance for everyone involved." "What changes in my behavior?" Jessica answered before Dr. Marsh could respond. "You've become paranoid and suspicious, Mom. You're refusing reasonable suggestions about planning for your future. You're acting like we're trying to hurt you when we're just trying to help." The accusation of paranoia was particularly galling because my suspicions had turned out to be completely justified. My children were indeed trying to gain control over my life and my assets, exactly as I'd suspected. Being right about their motivations wasn't paranoia, it was accurate perception. "I'm not paranoid, Jessica. I'm realistic about what's happening here. You and your siblings have decided that I'm no longer capable of managing my own life, and you're looking for medical support for that position. I don't consent to this evaluation, and I'm asking all of you to leave my house." Dr. Marsh tried again with his professional tone. "Mrs. Patterson, resistance to evaluation can sometimes be a sign of cognitive decline. People who are developing dementia often lack insight into their condition and become defensive when others try to help them. It was a clever psychological trap. Agree to the evaluation and risk having my competence questioned, or refuse the evaluation and have my refusal used as evidence of incompetence. Either way, my children would have ammunition to support their claim that I needed their intervention." "Marsh, I have recent documentation from Dr. Patricia Hawkins confirming my cognitive competence. If you'd like to review those records,
you're welcome to contact her off, but I do not consent to an evaluation by a psychiatrist that my children brought to my home without my knowledge or permission. David spoke up for the first time since they'd arrived. Margaret, we're all concerned about you. This evaluation is for your own protection. My protection from what? From making decisions you might regret later, from people who might take advantage of your condition, from situations that could put you at risk. There it was again, the suggestion that I needed protection from my own decisions, that my judgment couldn't be trusted, that other people were better qualified to determine what was in my best interest. It was the same paternalistic attitude that had characterized all of my children's recent interactions with me. The only people who have tried to take advantage of me are standing in my living room right now. I'm asking you to leave. Jessica's mask of concern finally slipped, revealing the frustration and anger underneath. Fine, Mom, but don't say we didn't try to help when things go wrong. Don't come crying to us when you realize you needed our support and threw it away because you're too stubborn to accept help. After they left, I called Catherine Morrison to report what had happened and to ask about additional protections I might need to put in place. The fact that my children had brought a psychiatrist to my home without my consent suggested they were escalating their efforts to have me declared incompetent. We need to be proactive about this, Catherine said. I'm going to contact Hawkins and ask her to provide an updated written assessment of your cognitive abilities. I'm also going to send a letter to your children informing them that any further attempts to have you evaluated without your consent could be considered harassment. Can they force me to undergo a psychiatric evaluation? Not without a court order, and they would need compelling evidence of incompetence to get one. The fact that you have recent documentation of cognitive competence from a qualified neurologist would make it very difficult for them to convince a judge that an involuntary evaluation is necessary. Catherine's letter to my children was professionally written but unambiguously clear. Any further attempts to pressure me into medical evaluations or legal arrangements would be considered elder abuse and could result in legal action against them. The letter also informed them that I had legal representation and that all future communications should go through Catherine's office rather than directly to me. The letter had exactly the effect Catherine had intended. My children stopped making surprise visits, stopped bringing medical professionals to my home, and stopped pressuring me directly about power of attorney documents or psychiatric evaluations. But the sudden silence was more ominous than their previous harassment had been. I had the feeling they were regrouping, planning a different approach to gaining control over my life and my assets. The new approach became clear 3 weeks later when Amanda called to tell me she was concerned about my safety living alone and had found the perfect solution to address everyone's worries about my well-being. Mom, I've been researching senior living communities, and I found this amazing place called Sunset Manor. It's more like a luxury hotel than a nursing home, individual apartments, gourmet dining, activities and social programs, medical staff on site, 24 hours a day. You'd love it there. I'm not interested in moving to a senior living facility, Amanda. I'm perfectly happy in my own home. But Mom, think about how much easier your life would be if you didn't have to worry about cooking and cleaning and maintaining a house. Think about the peace of mind of having medical help available if you need it. Think about the social opportunities, the chance to make new friends your own age. Every benefit she described was designed to make my current living situation seem inadequate and isolated. The implication was that living independently was somehow inferior to living in an institutional setting, that autonomy was less valuable than convenience and security. Amanda, I appreciate your concern, but I have no intention of leaving my home. I'm comfortable here, I'm managing fine on my own, and I don't need the kind of institutional support you're describing. Would you at least look at the brochures, just to see what's available? You might be surprised by how nice these places can be. Against my better judgment, I agreed to look at the materials she wanted to send me, partly out of curiosity, and partly to show that I was capable of considering information objectively, even when I disagreed with the underlying suggestion.
The brochures arrived 2 days later in a large envelope that also contained a personal letter from the director of Sunset Manor, welcoming me to tour their facility and discussing the various levels of care they provided for residents with different needs. The letter made it clear that Amanda had already contacted them about me and had probably provided information about my situation that portrayed me as someone who needed institutional care. The brochures themselves were exactly what Amanda had described. Glossy marketing materials that made senior living look like a luxury vacation resort, rather than a place where elderly people went to spend their final years. The apartments were spacious and well-appointed. The dining rooms looked elegant, and the activity program seemed designed to keep residents busy and entertained. But underneath the appealing presentation, I could see the reality of what these places represented: the end of independent living, the beginning of institutional management, and the gradual erosion of personal autonomy in exchange for security and convenience. Once I moved into a place like Sunset Manor, my children would have achieved their goal of having me managed by professionals rather than managing my own life. More importantly, moving to a senior living facility would make it much easier for my children to argue that I was no longer capable of independent decision-making. If I needed institutional support for daily living, how could I claim to be competent to manage my own financial affairs? I called Helen to discuss the situation and to get her perspective on whether I was being unreasonably resistant to a change that might actually benefit me. "Margaret, you're not ready for assisted living. You're managing fine in your own home, you're cognitively sharp, and you're physically capable of taking care of yourself. The only reason your children want you to move is because it would make you easier to control. But what if something does happen to me? What if I fall and can't get help? What if I have a medical emergency when I'm alone? Those are risks that every elderly person faces, whether they live independently or in a facility. You have a medical alert system, you have neighbors who check on you, and you have friends like me who are in regular contact. You're probably safer in your own home than you would be in an institutional setting where your individual needs might not get the attention they deserve." Helen was right. As usual, my children's suggestions about senior living were motivated by their desire to have me managed by professionals rather than by genuine concerns about my safety or well-being. Moving to Sunset Manor would solve their problem of having a mother who insisted on making her own decisions, but it would create enormous problems for me in terms of lost autonomy and independence. I sent the brochures back to Amanda with a polite note explaining that I was not interested in moving to a senior living facility at this time. I thanked her for her concern but reiterated that I was happy and comfortable in my own home, and had no plans to change my living situation. Her response came by phone 2 days later, and her tone was significantly less patient than it had been during previous conversations. "Mom, you're being completely unrealistic about your situation. You're almost 70 years old, living alone in a house that's too big for you, with no one around to help if something goes wrong. Sunset Manor would give you security, social opportunities, and professional care if you need it. I don't understand why you're so opposed to considering options that would improve your quality of life." "Because my quality of life is fine the way it is. Amanda, I don't want to live in an institution no matter how nice it is. I want to stay in my own home, with my own things, making my own decisions about how to spend my time." "But what happens when you can't make good decisions anymore? What happens when your memory gets worse or you have a medical crisis? Wouldn't it be better to make the transition while you're still healthy rather than waiting until it becomes an emergency?" There was the core of their argument, the assumption that my decline was inevitable and imminent, that moving to institutional care was a question of when rather than if. They were asking me to give up my independence preemptively based on problems I might develop rather than problems I actually had. "Amanda, if and when I reach a point where I can't live independently, I'll reconsider my option. But that point hasn't arrived yet, and I'm not going to make major life changes based on hypothetical future problems." "You're being stubborn and short-sighted, Mom. We're trying to help you plan for your future, but you're acting like we're your enemies instead of your children who love you." The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to be effective. I was being stubborn, in the sense that I was refusing to accept their definition of what was best for me. But my stubbornness was based on a realistic assessment of my current capabilities and a determination to maintain my autonomy for as long as possible. "I don't think you're my enemies, Amanda. I think you're worried about me, and I think you genuinely believe that institutional care would be better for me than independent living. But I disagree with your assessment, and I'm not going to make major life changes just to ease your anxiety about my well-being. The conversation ended with Amanda expressing frustration about my unrealistic attitude and warning me that my refusal to accept help was putting unnecessary stress on the entire family. It was another example of the emotional manipulation that had characterized all of my children's recent interactions with me. The suggestion that my insistence on autonomy was selfish because it made them worry. The escalation I'd been expecting came the following week, when all three of my children arrived at my house together for what they called a family meeting. They'd clearly coordinated their approach and had probably rehearsed their arguments in advance. Jessica carried a folder full of documents, Timothy had what appeared to be a legal brief, and Amanda brought a box of tissues, presumably for the emotional appeal she was planning to make. "Mom, we need to have a serious conversation about your future," Jessica began. "We've been patient and respectful of your wishes, but we can't continue to stand by and watch you make decisions that put you at risk." "What decisions are those?" Timothy answered. "Your refusal to accept appropriate medical evaluation, your refusal to consider appropriate living arrangement, your refusal to put legal protections in place for your financial assets, your refusal to acknowledge that you might need help managing your affairs." Each refusal he listed was presented as evidence of poor judgment rather than as the exercise of my right to make my own decision. They had reframed my autonomy as stubbornness and my resistance to their control as evidence of incompetence. "I've had appropriate medical evaluation, Timothy. Dr. Hawkins confirmed that I'm cognitively competent and capable of managing my own affairs. I don't need to move to a senior living facility because I'm managing fine in my own home. And I don't need legal protections that would give you control over my assets, because I'm perfectly capable of protecting them myself." Amanda opened the box of tissues and pulled one out, dabbing at her eyes in preparation for her emotional appeal. "Mom, we love you so much, and it breaks our hearts to see you struggling like this. We know you think you can handle everything on your own, but we can see that you're not the same person you used to be. You're more forgetful, more confused, more resistant to help. We're scared that something terrible is going to happen to you, and we'll have to live with the knowledge that we could have prevented it if you'd just listened to us." It was a masterful piece of emotional manipulation, designed to make me feel guilty for causing my children distress and to frame their desire for control as evidence of their love and concern. The tears were probably genuine, motivated by their real anxiety about losing control over my life and my assets, but they were being used to manipulate me into compliance with their demand. "Amanda, I understand that you're worried about me, but your anxiety doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my life. I'm a competent adult and I have the right to live independently as long as I'm capable of doing so safely." Jessica opened her folder and pulled out a document that looked like a legal petition. "Mom, we were hoping it wouldn't come to this, but you're not giving us any choice. We've consulted with an attorney about filing for guardianship. We have medical evidence that you're showing signs of cognitive decline. We have documentation of your refusal to accept appropriate care, and we have testimony from family members about your increasing inability to make sound decisions." The threat was clear and immediate: comply with their demands voluntarily, or they would try to force compliance through the legal system. They were prepared to have me declared legally incompetent and have a guardian appointed to make decisions on my behalf. "What medical evidence?" Timothy answered. "Dr. Marsh's evaluation, which documented your paranoid thinking and resistance to appropriate medical care, your own admission that you've been experiencing memory problems, your refusal to undergo comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, your increasingly erratic behavior regarding financial decisions and living arrangements." I stared at my children, these three adults I had raised from infancy, and felt something cold and hard settle in my chest. They were prepared to destroy my reputation, my independence, and my dignity to get what they wanted. They were willing to have me declared legally incompetent based on lies, distortions, and the testimony of a psychiatrist I had never consented to see. "You're threatening to have me declared incompetent because I won't sign over control of my life to you." Jessica's voice took on the patient tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Mom, we're trying to protect you from yourself. You're not thinking clearly anymore. You're making dangerous decisions. You need someone to help you manage your affairs before you hurt yourself or lose everything you've worked for." The only dangerous decision I've made recently was trusting my children to respect my autonomy and judgment. Amanda reached for another tissue. Mom, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We don't want to go to court. We don't want to have a judge decide what's best for you. But we will if that's what it takes to keep you safe. The meeting ended with my children giving me what they called one last chance to reconsider their suggestions about power of attorney, medical evaluation, and moving to assisted living. If I continued to refuse their help, they would file the guardianship petition and let a court decide whether I was competent to manage my own affairs. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, staring at the family photos on the mantelpiece and trying to reconcile the smiling children in those pictures with the adults who had just threatened to have me declared legally incompetent. When had they stopped being my children and become my adversaries? When had their love become conditional on my compliance with their demands? I called Catherine Morrison immediately to report what had happened and to ask about my legal options for defending against a guardianship petition. "They're bluffing," Catherine said after I'd described the meeting. "They don't have the evidence they would need to convince a court that you're incompetent. Dr. Marsh's evaluation was conducted without your consent and wouldn't be admissible in court. Dr. Hawkins's evaluation clearly documents your competence, and their claims about erratic behavior are based on your refusal to comply with their demands, not on any evidence of cognitive decline. But what if they find a judge who believes them? What if they convince someone that I really am incompetent? Margaret, you have recent medical documentation of your cognitive competence. You're managing a complex financial portfolio successfully. You're living independently without any problems. You have legal representation. Any judge would have to ignore substantial evidence of your competence to rule in your children's favor." Catherine was probably right, but the threat of a guardianship hearing was still terrifying. Even if I won, the process would be humiliating and expensive. My children would have succeeded in portraying me as someone whose competence was questionable, even if they couldn't prove I was actually incompetent. More importantly, the fact that they were willing to take this step told me everything I needed to know about their priorities and their character. They valued control over my assets more than they valued my dignity, my autonomy, or my happiness. They were prepared to destroy our relationship and my reputation to get what they wanted. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If my children were determined to treat me as an adversary rather than as their mother, then I would respond accordingly. If they valued my money more than my well-being, then I would make sure they never had access to either. I called Catherine the next morning and asked her to schedule an emergency meeting to revise my estate plan. "I want to remove my children as beneficiaries entirely," I told her. "I want to redirect my assets to organizations that actually help people instead of exploiting them." "That's a significant decision, Margaret. Are you sure you want to make such a dramatic change while you're dealing with this kind of family stress?" "I'm absolutely certain. My children have shown me exactly who they are and what they value. They've made it clear that they see me as an obstacle to their inheritance rather than as a person deserving of respect and autonomy. I want my estate to reflect my values rather than rewarding their greed and manipulation." We spent the morning revising my will and trust documents to redirect the bulk of my $7 million estate to charitable organizations that aligned with my values. The Alzheimer's Association would receive $2 million to fund research into the disease my children claimed I was developing. The Elder Justice Coalition would receive $2 million to help other older adults protect themselves from financial exploitation by family members. Local organizations that provided services to elderly people would receive substantial donations to continue their work helping people maintain their independence and dignity. I also established a fund to provide legal assistance to other elderly people whose families were trying to exploit them financially. If my children's threats taught me anything, it was that many older adults probably faced similar situations without the resources to protect themselves effectively. My children would inherit nothing, but they would receive detailed letters explaining exactly why their inheritance had been redirected to people and organizations that actually deserved support. I wanted them to understand that their greed and manipulation had consequences that extended far beyond their relationship with me.
The process of disinheriting my children was both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating because it gave me back a sense of control over my own life and assets. Heartbreaking because it forced me to acknowledge that the children I had raised and loved were not the people I had hoped they would become, but I felt no guilt about my decision. My children had made their priorities clear when they threatened to have me declared incompetent for refusing to give them control over my assets. They had chosen money over love, control over respect, and manipulation over genuine concern for my well-being. Catherine finished the revised documents within a week, and I signed them in the presence of witnesses who could testify to my mental competence if necessary. The new will and trust were legally bulletproof, designed to withstand any challenge my children might mount after my death. More importantly, the documents included specific provisions that would make it difficult for my children to claim I had been mentally incompetent when I signed them. Dr. Hawkins had provided an updated cognitive evaluation confirming my mental competence on the day I signed the new will. The witnesses included a retired judge and a practicing physician who could testify that I had understood exactly what I was doing and why. With my estate plan secured, I felt ready to face whatever my children tried to do next. If they wanted to file a guardianship petition, they were welcome to try. The court process would be expensive and embarrassing for them, and they would lose. More importantly, it would create a public record of their attempts to exploit me financially, which might help other elderly people recognize similar situations in their own families. But I also knew that I needed to protect myself from more immediate threat. If my children were willing to try to have me declared incompetent, they might be willing to take more direct action to gain control over my life and my assets. I asked Catherine about the possibility of getting a restraining order to prevent my children from harassing me or entering my property without permission. Based on what they've done so far, you might have grounds for a harassment order, Catherine said. Bringing an unauthorized psychiatrist to your home, threatening guardianship proceedings, and pressuring you to sign legal documents could all be considered forms of elder abuse. I don't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily, but I also don't want to be caught off guard if they decide to take more aggressive action. Let's wait and see what they do next. If they file the guardianship petition, we'll respond aggressively and ask for sanctions against them for filing frivolous legal proceedings. If they continue to harass you directly, we'll seek a restraining order. Either way, you're in a strong legal position. I spent the next few weeks in a strange state of calm anticipation, waiting for my children to make their next move, while enjoying the peace of knowing that I had protected myself from their attempts to control my life. I continued my normal routines, had lunch with Helen, worked in my garden, and read books I'd been meaning to get to for years. The quiet was broken when Jessica called 3 weeks later, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Mom, we need to talk. Can I come over?" "I'd prefer to talk on the phone, Jessica. This isn't something we should discuss over the phone. I'm coming over." She arrived 20 minutes later, alone this time, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the kind of expression that suggested she was preparing for battle. I let her in but remained standing in the foyer, making it clear that this would be a brief conversation. "Mom, I just got a very disturbing call from Catherine Morrison's office. She says you've been working with them to revise your estate plan. She says you've made some major changes to your will." I wasn't surprised that Catherine's office had been in contact with Jessica. Estate planning attorneys often reached out to family members when significant changes were made, both to prevent future legal challenges and to give families an opportunity to address any concerns before the documents were finalized. That's correct. I've updated my will to reflect my current priorities and values. What kind of changes? Changes that are none of your business, Jessica. My estate plan is my private affair, and I'm not obligated to discuss it with you or anyone else. Jessica's professional composure cracked slightly. "Mom, you can't be serious about cutting us out of your will. We're your children. We love you. We've been trying to help you even when you've been resistant and difficult. You've been trying to control me, Jessica. There's a difference between help and manipulation, and you've chosen manipulation." "That's not true. Everything we've suggested has been for your own good. The power of attorney would protect your assets. The medical evaluation would establish your cognitive status. The senior living facility would ensure your safety and care. We've been thinking about your well-being, not about money. If you'd been thinking about my well-being, you would have respected my autonomy instead of threatening to have me declared incompetent. If you'd been thinking about my happiness, you would have supported my decision to continue living independently instead of pressuring me to move to an institution. And if you'd been thinking about our relationship, you would have treated me like a person deserving of respect instead of like a problem to be managed. Jessica opened the manila envelope and pulled out what appeared to be legal documents. Mom, we filed the guardianship petition this morning. We didn't want to, but you've left us no choice. You're not thinking clearly, and someone needs to protect you from making decisions you'll regret. The threat had become reality. My children had actually filed legal papers asking a court to declare me incompetent and appoint a guardian to make decisions on my behalf. They were prepared to destroy my reputation and my independence to gain control over my assets. What evidence did you present to support your petition? Marcia's evaluation documenting your paranoid thinking and resistance to medical care, testimony from family members about your erratic behavior and poor judgment, documentation of your refusal to accept appropriate assistance with financial and living arrangement, evidence that you've been making impulsive and potentially harmful changes to important legal documents. Each piece of evidence was a distortion of reality designed to paint my reasonable decisions as signs of incompetence. My refusal to be evaluated by a psychiatrist that they brought to my home became resistance to medical care. My insistence on living independently became refusal to accept appropriate assistance. My decision to revise my estate plan became impulsive and potentially harmful changes. Jessica, you and your siblings are about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between wanting something and being entitled to it. What do you mean? I mean that your guardianship petition is going to fail, and fail spectacularly. I have recent medical documentation of my competence from a qualified neurologist. I have legal representation. I have witnesses who can testify to my mental acuity and sound judgment, and I have a very clear understanding of why you're really doing this. Jessica's mask of concern finally slipped completely, revealing the anger and frustration underneath. Fine, Mom, if you want to fight this in court, we'll fight it in court. But don't blame us when a judge decides that you really do need someone to protect you from yourself. After she left, I called Catherine to report that the guardianship petition had been filed and to ask about our next steps. They filed faster than I expected, Catherine said, but that might actually work in our favor. It shows they're acting impulsively rather than based on genuine medical evidence of incompetence. What happens now? We respond aggressively. We present Hawkins' evaluation. We present evidence of your competent management of your affairs, and we ask the court to dismiss the petition and award attorney's fees against your children for filing frivolous legal proceedings. How long will this take? Probably 2 to 3 months from filing to resolution. But Margaret, I want you to understand something. Even if we win, and we will win, this process is going to be difficult. Your children are going to present their case publicly. There will be testimony about your mental state, your behavior, your decisions. It's going to be invasive and humiliating. I understand, but it's important that other people see what happens when adult children try to exploit their elderly parents. Maybe my case will help someone else recognize the warning signs before it's too late. The next few weeks were a strange mixture of ordinary daily life and extraordinary legal preparation. I continued my normal routines, while also working with Catherine to prepare for the guardianship hearing. We gathered medical records, financial statements, and testimony from friends and neighbors who could speak to my competence and independence. Dr. Hawkins agreed to testify on my behalf, and her testimony would be crucial in establishing that I was mentally competent and capable of making my own decisions. Helen agreed to testify about my judgment and decision-making abilities. Even Miss Chain, my elderly neighbor who barely spoke English, agreed to testify about my capability to live independently and manage my own affairs. The preparation process was thorough but also empowering. Catherine was building a case that wouldn't just defeat my children's petition, it would demonstrate beyond any doubt that their claims were baseless and motivated by greed rather than genuine concern for my well-being. But I also knew that winning the legal battle wouldn't repair my relationship with my children. They had already shown me who they really were and what they valued most. Even if they lost in court, even if they were forced to pay my attorney's fees, even if they were publicly humiliated by the process, they would probably never acknowledge that they had been wrong to try to control my life. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in February, and I arrived at the courthouse, with Catherine feeling nervous but confident. My children were already there with their attorney, a man named Robert Sterling who specialized in elder law and guardianship proceedings. They had dressed formally for the occasion, probably hoping to project an image of responsible adults concerned about their elderly mother's welfare. Judge Patricia Caldwell presided over the hearing, and her reputation for fairness and thoroughness gave me confidence that the case would be decided based on evidence, rather than emotion. She began by explaining the legal standard for guardianship, clear and convincing evidence that I was unable to make informed decisions about my personal care or my property. Sterling presented my children's case first, calling Dr. Marsh to testify about his evaluation of my mental state. Dr. Marsh described his brief encounter with me at my home, focusing on what he characterized as my paranoid thinking and resistance to appropriate medical intervention. Catherine's cross-examination of Dr. Marsh was devastating. She established that he had never actually examined me, that his evaluation was based on a single brief conversation conducted without my consent, and that his conclusions were not supported by any objective testing or medical evidence. Dr. Marsh, Catherine asked, "Are you aware that Ms. Patterson had a comprehensive cognitive evaluation by Dr. Patricia Hawkins, just 2 weeks before your visit to her home?" "I was not aware of that." "Are you aware that Dr. Hawkins's evaluation found no evidence of cognitive decline or mental incompetence?" "I was not provided with those records." "Did you review any medical records before reaching your conclusions about Mrs. Patterson's mental state?" "I based my assessment on my clinical observations during our interaction." "Clinical observations based on a 10-minute conversation in Mrs. Patterson's living room." "The duration of the interaction is less important than the quality of the clinical information obtained." Catherine then presented Dr. Hawkins's evaluation, which included detailed cognitive testing, medical history review, and objective measures of mental competence. The contrast between Dr. Hawkins's thorough professional assessment and Dr. Marsh's superficial impression was stark and damaging to my children's case. Jessica testified next, describing her concerns about my memory problems, my resistance to accepting help, and my increasingly erratic behavior regarding financial and living arrangements. She presented herself as a loving daughter who was worried about her mother's safety and well-being. Catherine's cross-examination focused on the timeline of Jessica's concerns and the specific incidents she cited as evidence of my incompetence. "Ms. Patterson, when did you first become concerned about your mother's mental state?" "I started noticing changes about 6 months ago." "What prompted your concern?" "She mentioned that she'd been feeling forgetful lately, and prior to that conversation, had you noticed any problems with her judgment or decision-making?" "Well, no, but she's very good at hiding problems." "Ms. Patterson, isn't it true that your concerns about your mother's mental state coincided with your discovery that she had significant financial assets?" Sterling objected, but Judge Caldwell allowed the question. "I've always known my mother was financially comfortable." "But you didn't know the extent of her wealth until recently, did you?" "The specific amount isn't important."
We're concerned about her ability to protect her assets from exploitation. Exploitation by whom? By anyone who might take advantage of her condition. Ms. Patterson, have you or your siblings ever asked your mother for money? Not directly, but we've suggested that she might want to consider giving us power of attorney to help manage her affairs. And your mother refused those suggestions. She's been resistant to accepting help. Catherine then presented evidence of my competent financial management, including statements from my investment advisor confirming that I had been making sound financial decisions and actively managing my portfolio. She presented testimony from Helen about my judgment and decision-making abilities. She presented testimony from neighbors who confirmed that I was living independently without any problems. Most importantly, She presented Dr. Hawkins' testimony about my cognitive evaluation and current mental status. Dr. Hawkins was an impressive witness, professionally credentialed and completely confident in her assessment that I was mentally competent and fully capable of managing my own affairs. Dr. Hawkins, Catherine asked, in your professional opinion, does Mrs. Patterson require a guardian to make decisions about her personal care or her property? Absolutely not. Mrs. Patterson is mentally competent, cognitively intact, and fully capable of making informed decisions about all aspects of her life. Is there any medical evidence that would support the appointment of a guardian in this case? None whatsoever. Ms. Patterson's cognitive function is normal for her age, and she shows no signs of dementia, mental illness, or any other condition that would impair her decision-making ability. The hearing concluded with closing arguments from both attorneys. Sterling argued that my resistance to my children's suggestions demonstrated poor judgment and that my recent changes to my estate plan were evidence of impulsive decision-making that required intervention. Catherine argued that my resistance to my children's suggestions demonstrated good judgment and that my estate planning decisions were evidence of thoughtful consideration of my values and priorities. She asked the court to dismiss the petition and award attorney's fees against my children for filing frivolous legal proceedings. Judge Caldwell took the case under advisement and promised a decision within 2 weeks. I left the courthouse feeling confident that we had presented a strong case, but also emotionally drained by the process of having my mental competence publicly questioned by my own children. The decision came exactly 2 weeks later in the form of a written order that was even more favorable than I had hoped. Judge Caldwell not only dismissed my children's guardianship petition, but also found that it had been filed without sufficient evidence and awarded attorney's fees against them. More importantly, the judge's written order included language that would make it very difficult for my children to file similar petitions in the future. She found that I was clearly competent to make decisions about my personal care and property, and that there was no credible evidence of cognitive decline or impaired judgment. The order was a complete vindication of my position and a complete repudiation of my children's claim. They had not only lost their case, they had been publicly humiliated and ordered to pay my legal expenses. Catherine called to congratulate me on the victory and to discuss the implications of the judge's order. This is about as definitive a win as you could hope for, Margaret. Your children's credibility has been destroyed, and any future attempts to challenge your competence will be met with extreme skepticism by the courts. What happens now? Now you continue living your life exactly as you choose. Your children have no legal basis for interfering with your decisions, and they know it. They've learned a very expensive lesson about the difference between wanting control over someone's life and being entitled to it. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction at the outcome, not because I had defeated my children, but because I had protected my right to live independently and make my own decisions. The legal victory was important, but the personal victory was even more significant. That evening I called Helen to share the news and to talk about what the victory meant for my future relationship with my children. I'm proud of you for standing up to them. Too many elderly people give in to pressure from their families because they're afraid of conflict or because they want to maintain relationships at any cost. You showed them that love and respect have to go both ways. I don't know if there's any way to repair our relationship after this. Maybe not, and maybe that's for the best. Children who are willing to have their mother declared incompetent to get access to her money aren't the kind of people you want making decisions about your life anyway. Helen was right. As usual, my children had shown me exactly who they were and what they valued. The legal victory had protected my assets and my autonomy, but it couldn't change the fundamental reality that my children valued money more than they valued me. 2 days after the court decision, Amanda called to attempt what I assumed would be some kind of reconciliation or apology. Mom, I want you to know that we never wanted things to go as far as they did. We were just worried about you. And maybe we handled it badly. The non-apology was typical of Amanda's approach to conflict resolution. She acknowledged that things had gone too far without accepting responsibility for her role in escalating them. She admitted that they had handled the situation badly without acknowledging that their fundamental approach had been wrong from the beginning. Amanda, You and your siblings threatened to have me declared incompetent because I wouldn't give you control over my life and my assets. That's not handling a situation badly, that's a fundamental betrayal of trust and respect. We were scared, Mom. We thought you were making dangerous decisions, and we didn't know how else to protect you. You were scared that I might spend or donate money you wanted to inherit. There's a difference between protecting someone and controlling them, and you chose control. That's not fair. We love you and we want what's best for you. If you loved me, you would have respected my autonomy. If you wanted what was best for me, you would have supported my decisions instead of trying to override them. And if you had any genuine concern for my well-being, you would never have threatened to have me declared incompetent. The conversation ended with Amanda expressing hope that we could move past this difficult time and rebuild our relationship, but her words felt hollow because they weren't accompanied by any real acknowledgement of what she and her siblings had done or any genuine apology for their behavior. I knew that my relationship with my children would never be the same. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, violated a trust that couldn't be restored. Even if they eventually came to understand that they had been wrong, even if they eventually offered genuine apologies, the damage to our relationship was permanent. But I also knew that I had protected myself and my assets from their attempts to control my life. The revised estate plan would ensure that my money went to people and organizations that would use it to help others, rather than to children who saw it as an entitlement. The legal victory had established my competence beyond any doubt, and made it virtually impossible for them to challenge my decisions in the future. Most importantly, I had learned something valuable about the difference between family relationships based on love and respect, and family relationships based on obligation and expectation. My children had shown me that they were more interested in what I could give them than in who I was as a person. The knowledge was painful but also liberating, because it freed me from the burden of trying to maintain relationships that were fundamentally one-sided. That night I sat in my living room with a cup of tea, and thought about the future I was going to build for myself. I was 70 years old, financially secure, mentally competent, and finally free from the pressure to meet other people's expectations about how I should live my life. It was a good foundation for whatever came next. The months following the court victory passed quietly, and I discovered that solitude suited me better than I had ever imagined. Without the constant pressure from my children to justify my decisions or defend my independence, I found myself relaxing into a rhythm of life that felt authentic and peaceful for the first time in years. I started taking art classes at the community center, something I had always wanted to try but never pursued when my time was consumed by family obligations and expectations. The instructor, a woman named Maria Santos, who had been painting for 40 years, encouraged students to explore their creativity without worrying about technical perfection or outside approval. Art is about expressing what's inside you, she told our small class of mostly older adults, who had finally given themselves permission to pursue interests they'd deferred for decades. Don't paint what you think other people want to see, paint what you need to say. The advice resonated beyond the canvas. I had spent too much of my life trying to be what other people needed me to be, accommodating their expectations and prioritizing their comfort over my own authenticity. Now, at 70, I was finally learning to express what was inside me without filtering it through other people's judgments or demands. My paintings were amateur but honest, capturing the colors and textures of the garden I was cultivating, the changing light in my living room throughout the day, the peaceful solitude of my morning coffee ritual. They weren't masterpieces, but they were mine in a way that felt deeply satisfying. Helen noticed the change in me during one of our weekly lunches, commenting that I seemed more relaxed and confident than she had seen me in years. "You look like someone who's finally comfortable in her own skin," she observed over salad at our favorite restaurant. "There's something different about you since the court case ended, something lighter." She was right. The legal victory had done more than protect my assets and establish my competence. It had freed me from the exhausting work of trying to maintain relationships with people who fundamentally didn't respect. I no longer had to defend my decisions to children who saw my independence as an obstacle to their inheritance. I no longer had to pretend that their manipulation was motivated by love rather than greed. I think I'm finally living for myself instead of living to meet other people's expectations, I told Helen. It's taken me 70 years to figure out the difference. The piece was interrupted in late spring when Timothy called, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone who had rehearsed the conversation in advance. Mom, I hope you're doing well. I've been thinking about you a lot lately, and I wanted to reach out to see how you're settling into your new normal. His phrasing was careful, acknowledging the change dynamic between us without directly addressing the reasons for the change. It was the kind of diplomatic language people use when they want to rebuild a relationship without acknowledging their role in damaging it. I'm doing very well, Timothy. Thank you for asking. Good. Listen, I know things got complicated between us last year, and I wanted you to know that I've been reflecting on everything that happened. I think maybe we all got a little carried away with our concerns about your well-being. The understatement was breathtaking. They hadn't gotten a little carried away with their concerns. They had threatened to have me declared incompetent and filed legal papers to gain control over my life and assets. But Timothy was presenting their behavior as an excess of caring rather than an attempt at financial exploitation. What prompted this reflection, Timothy? Well, obviously the court ruling made it clear that our concerns were misplaced. You're obviously competent to make your own decisions, and we should have respected that from the beginning. It was as close to an admission of wrongdoing as I was likely to get from any of my children, though it was couched in language that minimized their culpability and avoided any real accountability for their actions. I appreciate you acknowledging. The thing is, Mom, I've been hoping we might be able to rebuild our relationship. I know trust has been damaged, and I know it will take time to repair that, but you're still our mother, and we're still your children, and I hate the idea that our family has been torn apart over misunderstandings and poor communication. The characterization of their behavior as misunderstandings and poor communication was another attempt to minimize the severity of what they had done. They hadn't misunderstood my position, they had deliberately ignored it. They hadn't communicated poorly. They had threatened and manipulated me when I refused to comply with their demands. Timothy, what you and your sisters did wasn't a misunderstanding. You threatened to have me declared incompetent because I wouldn't give you control over my assets. That's not poor communication. That's attempted financial exploitation. There was a long pause before he responded, and when he did, his voice had lost some of its forced cheerfulness. Mom, I understand you're still angry about what happened, and I don't blame you for that. But don't you think it's time to consider forgiveness? Don't you think our family relationships are worth trying to save? The question contained an implicit assumption that forgiveness was something I owed my children, that maintaining family relationships was more important than holding people accountable for their behavior. It was the same kind of emotional manipulation they had used throughout the guardianship crisis, presenting their desires as moral obligations I was expected to fulfill. Timothy, forgiveness isn't the same thing as reconciliation. I can forgive you for what you did without trusting you not to do it again, and I can love you as my son without allowing you back into my life in ways that give you opportunities to hurt me. So that's it. You're never going to have a relationship with any of us again. I'm going to have the kind of relationship with each of you that your behavior has earned. If you want a different kind of relationship, you'll need to demonstrate through your actions that you've genuinely changed, not just that you've decided you want access to me again. The conversation ended with Timothy expressing disappointment about my unwillingness to move forward, and my focus on past hurts instead of future possibility. It was another example of the blame shifting that had characterized all of my children's responses to the consequences of their behavior. After hanging up, I sat in my garden and thought about forgiveness and accountability, about the difference between being loving and being naive. I could forgive my children for their greed and manipulation without pretending that their apologies were sincere or that their behavior was likely to change. The revised estate plan I had created with Catherine's help reflected this understanding. The bulk of my assets would go to organizations that actually helped people rather than to children who had shown they were more interested in what they could take from me than in what they could give to others. But I had also made provisions for a different kind of legacy, one that might actually make a difference in my children's lives even if they never inherited my money.
I had established a fund to provide financial literacy education and elder abuse prevention services in our community, using my experience as a teaching tool to help other families avoid the kind of destructive dynamics that had torn mine apart. The fund would sponsor workshops on recognizing the signs of financial exploitation by family members, provide resources for elderly people who were facing pressure from their adult children, and offer support for families who wanted to have honest conversations about inheritance and end-of-life planning before crisis situations arose. It was a way of turning my painful experience into something constructive, of using the knowledge I had gained about family manipulation and elder abuse to help other people protect themselves from similar situations. The money my children had tried to control would instead be used to empower other elderly people to maintain their autonomy and dignity. Summer arrived with a heat wave that kept me indoors more than usual, giving me time to read and reflect on the changes in my life over the past year. I had started keeping a journal, something I had never done before, and the process of writing about my experiences helped me understand how much I had grown and changed since the guardianship crisis began. The woman who had initially been hurt and confused by her children's behavior had evolved into someone who understood the difference between family loyalty and self-respect, between love and enablement. I had learned that some relationships were worth fighting for, and others were worth walking away from, and that the distinction wasn't always easy to make but was always important to recognize. I had also learned that financial security, while valuable, was meaningless without the freedom to make my own choices about how to use it. My children's attempts to control my assets had been attempts to control my life, and resisting them had been about more than money. It had been about maintaining my right to live according to my own values and priorities. The journal entries from that summer reflect a growing sense of peace and purpose that I hadn't experienced in years. I was no longer defined by my relationships to other people, or by my obligations to meet their expectations. I was simply Margaret Chen, a 70-year-old woman who had survived attempted exploitation by her own children and emerged stronger and more independent than she had ever imagined possible. The first test of my children's supposed desire for reconciliation came in August when Jessica called to invite me to my grandson Michael's birthday party. Michael was Jessica's eldest son, a sweet boy who had just turned 12, and I had always enjoyed spending time with him before the family crisis had made such interactions impossible. "Mom, I know things have been strained between us, but Michael specifically asked if you would be at his party. He misses you, and he doesn't understand why you haven't been around lately." The invitation was clearly designed to use my emotional connection to my grandson as leverage to rebuild a relationship with Jessica, but it also represented a genuine opportunity to see Michael and maintain that relationship independent of my conflicts with his mother. "What does Michael know about what happened between us?" "Nothing specific. We told him that you've been busy with your own activities, and that grown-up relationships sometimes go through difficult periods. He's too young to understand the details. And what would you expect from me if I attended the party? Just to be his grandmother, to celebrate his birthday and spend time with him. I'm not asking you to pretend that everything is fine between us, just to put our differences aside for a few hours for Michael's sake." The request seemed reasonable on the surface, but I knew that Jessica was hoping my attendance would signal a willingness to begin rebuilding our relationship. She was using my love for Michael to create an opening for reconciliation that I hadn't agreed to, and wasn't ready for. "Jessica, I love Michael and I want to maintain a relationship with him, but I'm not willing to attend family gatherings where my presence is used to suggest that our conflicts have been resolved or that I'm ready to return to the kind of relationship we had before." "So you're going to punish an innocent child because you're angry at his mother?" The accusation was unfair but predictable. Jessica was framing my boundary setting as cruelty toward Michael rather than as protection of my own emotional well-being. It was another example of the manipulation tactics she had used throughout our conflicts, presenting her desires as moral obligations I was expected to fulfill. "I'm not punishing Michael, I'm protecting myself from being manipulated into situations that aren't emotionally safe for me. If you want me to have a relationship with Michael, we can arrange visits that don't involve me pretending that our family dynamics have been magically repaired." "Mom, he's just a little boy, He doesn't understand why his grandmother won't come to his birthday party. Then perhaps you should explain to him that his grandmother loves him, but needs to maintain some distance from family situations that have become complicated. Children are more capable of understanding difficult truths than adults often give them credit for. The conversation ended with Jessica accusing me of being selfish and vindictive, of prioritizing my own hurt feelings over my grandson's happiness. It was painful to hear, but I recognized it as another attempt to manipulate me into compliance with her agenda rather than a genuine concern for Michael's well-being. I sent Michael a birthday card with a substantial check and a note explaining that I was thinking of him on his special day and hoped we could spend time together soon. I also called him directly to wish him happy birthday and to let him know that my absence from his party didn't reflect any change in my feelings for him. "Grandma, are you okay?" he asked with the directness that children bring to complicated situations. Mom said, "You've been busy but you sound sad." "I'm doing well, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that make it difficult for them to be in the same place at the same time, but that doesn't change how much I love you or how proud I am of the young man you're becoming. Can I come visit you at your house sometime?" "I would love that, Michael. We'll arrange something very soon." The conversation with my grandson was a reminder that not all family relationships had been damaged by the guardianship crisis. Michael was innocent of his mother's manipulation and deserved to maintain a relationship with me independent of the conflicts between the adults in his life. I arranged with Jessica to have Michael visit me for a weekend later that month, making it clear that the visit was about my relationship with him and not about rebuilding my relationship with her. She agreed, probably hoping that spending time with Michael would soften my position toward the rest of the family. The weekend with Michael was wonderful in ways I hadn't expected. Without the complicated dynamics of larger family gatherings, we were able to simply enjoy each other's company. We worked in my garden, painted pictures, and had long conversations about his school, his friends, and his hopes for the future. He was curious about my life in ways that his mother and aunt and uncle had never been, asking about my art classes, my books, and my daily routines with genuine interest rather than concern about my competence or safety. "Grandma, you seem really happy," he observed as we sat on the porch after dinner, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Happier than you used to be at family dinners." His observation was perceptive and accurate. I was happier, more relaxed and authentic than I had been during the tense family gatherings that had preceded the guardianship crisis. Without the pressure to defend my decisions or justify my independence, I could simply be myself with him. "I am happy, Mike." Sometimes it takes a while for grown-ups to figure out how to live in ways that feel right for them. "Is that why you don't come to family stuff anymore?" "Partly. Sometimes people we love want different things for us than we want for ourselves, and that can make being together difficult." He nodded with the wisdom that children sometimes show when adults expect them to be confused by complexity. "Mom worries about you a lot," he said after a moment. "She thinks you're lonely." "I'm not lonely, sweetheart. I have good friends, interesting activities, and a life that feels peaceful and satisfying." "Your mother worries because she doesn't understand that being alone and being lonely are different things." When Jessica came to pick up Michael at the end of the weekend, she lingered in my foyer as if hoping I would invite her to stay for coffee and conversation. When I didn't extend the invitation, she tried a different approach. "Mom, Michael had such a wonderful time with you. He's been talking non-stop about your garden and your art projects. It means so much to him to have this relationship with you." "It means a lot to me, too. Michael is a remarkable young man, and I'm grateful to be his grandmother. I was thinking that maybe we could make this a regular thing. Maybe he could visit you once a month, and maybe sometimes I could stay for a little while when I drop him off, or pick him up." The suggestion was presented as being about Michael's benefit, but it was clearly an attempt to use his visits as opportunities to rebuild her relationship with me. She was hoping that my love for my grandson would create openings for the kind of reconciliation she wanted, without requiring her to acknowledge or address the behavior that had damaged our relationship. "Jessica, I'm happy to have Michael visit regularly, but those visits need to be about my relationship with him, not about rebuilding my relationship with you. If you want to work on our relationship, That's a separate conversation that needs to happen separately from my time with Michael. But don't you think it would be healthier for everyone if we could find a way to move forward as a family? I think it would be healthier for everyone if we could learn to respect each other's boundaries and accept that some relationships need to change in response to changed circumstances. She left that day looking frustrated, but not entirely defeated, and I suspected she would continue to use Michael's visits as opportunities to push for the kind of reconciliation that would absolve her of responsibility for her behavior while restoring her access to me and my assets. Fall arrived with a crispness that made me want to spend more time outdoors, and I found myself taking longer walks around the neighborhood and spending hours in my garden, preparing it for winter.
The physical work was satisfying in ways that surprised me, offering a sense of accomplishment that was entirely separate from other people's approval or recognition. I had also begun volunteering at the community center where I took art classes, helping with a program that provided services to elderly residents who needed assistance with daily tasks. The work gave me perspective on my own situation and reminded me how fortunate I was to be healthy, financially secure, and mentally competent at my age. Many of the people I helped were dealing with real cognitive decline, genuine medical crises, and actual safety concerns that made independent living difficult or horrible. Their situations were nothing like mine had been when my children decided I needed their intervention, and the contrast helped me understand even more clearly how inappropriate their behavior had been. The volunteer work also connected me with other elderly people who had experienced similar family dynamics, and their stories confirmed that my experience was far from unique. Adult children who became impatient with waiting for their inheritance, families who disguised greed as concern, elderly people who were pressured to give up their independence to ease their children's anxiety about their safety and assets. One woman named Dorothy Williams had been pressured by her son to move to an assisted living facility after she mentioned feeling dizzy during a recent visit to her doctor. The dizziness had turned out to be a side effect of a new medication, easily corrected with a dosage adjustment. But her son had used the incident to argue that she was no longer safe living alone. He had brochures ready, Dorothy told me as we organized supplies for a community dinner. Professional-looking materials about this lovely place where I could have my own apartment, but also have help available if I needed it. He'd already called them to arrange a tour. How did you respond? I told him I wasn't interested, and he got angry. Started talking about how stubborn I was being, how I was putting myself at risk, how he wouldn't be able to live with himself if something happened to me. He made it sound like moving to assisted living was the only responsible choice. Did you move? Almost did. The guilt was overwhelming. The idea that I was being selfish and stubborn, that I was causing my son distress because I wouldn't accept his help. But then my sister pointed out that he'd never shown much interest in my well-being before I inherited my husband's pension, and I started thinking about the timing of his sudden concern. Dorothy's story was so similar to mine that it felt like looking in a mirror. The same pattern of manufactured crisis, emotional manipulation, and demands disguised as concern. The same assumption that elderly people should be grateful for their children's intervention regardless of whether it was needed or wanted. What happened when you refused to move? He threatened to call social services, said he was going to report that I was living in an unsafe situation and needed protective intervention. That scared me enough that I called a lawyer and she helped me understand my rights and document my competence. Did your son follow through on his threat? No. Once he realized I had legal representation and wasn't going to be intimidated, he backed down. But our relationship never recovered. He still calls occasionally, but it's different now, more distant. I think he's waiting for me to become genuinely incompetent so he can try again. Dorothy's experience reinforced my understanding that my children's behavior had been part of a recognizable pattern of elder abuse, and that my response had been appropriate and necessary. It also reminded me that the damage to family relationships caused by such behavior was often permanent, regardless of whether the elderly person successfully resisted the pressure. As winter approached, I found myself reflecting on the year that had passed since the guardianship crisis began, and thinking about the lessons I had learned about family, autonomy, and the difference between love and control. The experience had been painful but also educational, teaching me things about myself and my children that I probably needed to know but had been reluctant to acknowledge. I had learned that I was stronger and more independent than I had given myself credit for, capable of standing up to pressure from people I loved when their demands conflicted with my values and well-being. I had learned that family loyalty was not a one-way obligation, that respect and consideration needed to flow in both directions for relationships to be healthy and sustainable. Most importantly, I had learned that money could be a poison in family relationships when it became more important than the people it was supposed to benefit. My children's focus on my assets had blinded them to my humanity, making them willing to sacrifice our relationship and my dignity to gain control over wealth they felt entitled to inherit. The revised estate plan that would redirect my assets to charitable organizations felt like the right response to their behavior, ensuring that my money would be used to help people rather than reward greed and manipulation. It was a legacy I could feel proud of, one that reflected my values rather than enabling their worst impulses. As I sat in my living room on a cold December evening, surrounded by the art I had created, and the books I had read and the peaceful solitude I had learned to appreciate, I felt a deep sense of contentment that had nothing to do with other people's approval or expectation. I had finally learned to live for myself, to make decisions based on my own judgment, rather than on my children's demands, or society's assumptions about how elderly people should behave. The phone rang occasionally with calls from Timothy or Amanda or Jessica, each hoping to find a path back into my life that didn't require them to acknowledge or address their behavior. But I had learned to recognize manipulation disguised as love, and I was no longer willing to sacrifice my peace and autonomy to maintain relationships with people who saw me as an obstacle to their inheritance, rather than as a person deserving of respect. My life at 70 was smaller than it had been but also more authentic, focused on relationships and activities that brought me genuine satisfaction rather than obligation or anxiety. I had good friends like Helen who valued me for who I was rather than what I could give them. I had meaningful work through my volunteer activities. I had creative pursuits that engaged my mind and spirit. Most importantly, I had the knowledge that I had protected myself and my assets from people who would have used both destructively, ensuring that my legacy would reflect my values rather than their greed. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was exactly the life I had chosen to build after learning the difference between being needed and being respected, between being family and being valued. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.